I call to order this meeting, the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats. Today's topic, an emerging threat, the emerging threat of resources wars. And after the ranking member and I each take 5 minutes to make opening remarks, each member present will have 1 minute to make their opening remarks, alternating between majority and minority members. And without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record. And hearing no objection, so ordered. And now for my opening statement. An increasing global demand for supplies of energy and strategic minerals is sparking intense economic competition that could lead to a counterproductive conflict. Who owns the resources, who has the right to develop them, where they will be sent and put to use, and who controls the transport routes from the fields to the final consumers are issues that must be addressed. Whether the outcomes result from competition or coercion, from market forces or state command, we will be determining how to achieve, and if we will achieve, a world of peace and an acceptable level of prosperity, or we won't achieve that noble goal. A zero-sum world where no one can obtain the means to progress without taking them from someone else is inherently a world of conflict. When new sources of supply are opened, as is the case with Central Asia, there is still fear that there is not enough to go around, and thus conflict emerges. Additional problems arise when supplies are located in areas where production could be disrupted by political upheaval, terrorism, or war. The wealth that results from resource development and the expansion of industrial production increases power just as it uplifts economies and uplifts the standards of peoples. This can feed an international rivalry on issues that go well beyond economics. We too often think of economics as being merely about business. But the distribution of industry resources and technology across the globe is the foundation for the international balance of power. And we need to pay more attention to the economic issues in our foreign policy and what will be the logical result of how we deal with those economic and those natural resource issues. The control of access to resources can be used as political leverage. As we've seen with Russia and China, they both have demonstrated that. Indeed, China is engaged in an aggressive campaign to control global energy supply chains and to protect its monopoly in rare earth elements. This obviously indicates that Beijing is abandoning its quote, peaceful rise, end of quote, policy. This is not an unexpected turn of events, given the brutal nature of the Communist Chinese regime. This hearing will look into this, and we'll look at the economic and geopolitical tensions underlining the competition and that we see for natural resources. And we need to discuss that competition, and we need to understand what is in the national interest of the United States and what must be protected to ensure that our people can enjoy a level of peace and prosperity in the future. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this timely hearing. Today's hearing topic provides us with an opportunity to look beyond Europe and Eurasia and examine the global impact of depleted resources, climate change, and expanding world population, and accompanying social rest. In March, for the first time, the Director of National Intelligence, James R. Clapper, listed, quote, competition and scarcity involving natural resources, unquote, as a national security threat on a path and on a par with global terrorism, cyber war, and nuclear proliferation. He also noted that, quote, terrorists, militants, and international crime groups are certain to use declining local food security to gain legitimacy and undermine government authority, unquote, in the future. I would add that the prospect of scarcities of vital resources, including energy, water, land, food, and rare earth elements, in itself would guarantee geopolitical friction. Now, add lone wolves and extremists who exploit these scenarios into the mix and the domestic relevance of today's conversation, and you can see the importance of this is clear. Further, it's no secret that threats are more interconnected today than they were, let's say, 15 years ago. Events which at first seemed local and irrelevant have the potential to set off transnational disruptions and affect U.S. national interests. We saw this dynamic play out off the coast of Somalia, where fishermen were growing frustrated from lack of governance and enforcement against vessels harming their stock, and where they took up arms and transitioned into dangerous gangs of pirates. Now, violent criminals threaten Americans and multinational vessels traveling through the Horn of Africa. Unfortunately, I don't see a near-term end to the coordinated international response that this situation requires. I agree with Mr. Clapper that the depletion of resources stemming from many factors, which above all include climate change, has potential to raise a host of issues for U.S. businesses worldwide, for U.S. officials, and for individuals that are traveling abroad themselves. For this reason, Mr. Chairman, I have long advocated for alternate energy resources. Yet as a representative of what will hopefully one day be our nation's first offshore wind farm, I deal daily with obstructive businesses and individuals trying to get in the way of this and other projects in exchange for increasing their company's net profits. I'd like to add that given our distinguished panel of witnesses today and our subcommittee's jurisdiction, I'm sure we'll be hearing about the tremendous energy reserves in Central Asia and the need for diversifying energy markets. In this regard, I'd like to take note that I have and will continue to advocate for the importance of increasing democratic governance and rule of law in that region. Energy production can get you only so far. I'd like to hear from our witnesses on how the United States can engage with Central Asian governments to improve governance and transparency in the energy sector, both bilaterally and through international organizations, such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. However, as we discuss these important issues, I hope that we can continue to keep our own country's movement towards an energy-independent future and the obstacles in its path in mind itself. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back my time.
Well, thank you very much. We also have with us Colonel Cook today, who is a new member of the Congress and making himself a very fine reputation. Colonel Cook, do you have an opening statement?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for having this hearing. And I think it's an issue that doesn't get much attention. And in my former life, besides being in the military for 26 years, I was a college professor. And I have to admit it, I taught history, and I always got to give the old saw that people who do not understand history are bound to repeat it. If you look at the history of conflicts and wars and everything else, and whether you go back to that famous book, The Haves and Have-Nots, it's always about resources and who has it and who doesn't have them and who wants them. And maybe you could make an analogy on that. But I think we as a country at least have not picked up on those lessons of history. And we're very, very naive about the motivations of certain countries and why they do certain things. And obviously there's things going on throughout the world right now in Eurasia which underscore some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So I applaud having a hearing on this. I think the title says it all, Resource Wars. And if we don't have the war yet, we've had it in the past, and we're going to have it in the future. So thank you.
Thank you. And let me just note that Colonel Cook is a former Marine officer, and my father was a Marine officer. I grew up on Marine bases. And
is that why I'm on the committee? Or,
but how that fits right in, of course, to what you were saying, Colonel, is that my father joined the Marines to fight World War II, and it's very clear that natural resources had a great deal to do with the Japanese strategies that led to the Second World War. And so we have some of our witnesses who may be talking to us, will be talking to us on issues that are of that significance. We have with us today Brigadier General John Adams, U.S. Army retired, is president of Guardian 6 Consulting, LLC, and the author of the report, Remaking American Security, Supply Chain Vulnerabilities and National Security Risks Across the Defense Industrial Base, published by Alliance for American Manufacturing in this May. General Adams served his final military assignment as Deputy U.S. Military Representative to the NATO Military Committee in Brussels, Belgium. And on September 11, 2001, General Adams was stationed at the Pentagon as Deputy Director of European Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And we know what happened on that day. During his 30 years in the Army, General Adams' assignments have ranged from aviation to military intelligence. He's a veteran of Desert Storm. He also has 3 master's degrees in international relations, strategic studies, and English. Excellent general that we have a general who has a degree in English. And is currently a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Arizona. We also have with us Edward C. Chow, is a senior fellow of the Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He spent 20 years with the Chevron Corporation in the United States and overseas, including as the country manager for China from 1989 to 1991, and he was then based in Beijing. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics, a master's degree in international affairs from Ohio University. He has just returned last week from a trip to Central Asia. We also have with us Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff. He is Deputy Director and Fellow in the Russian and Euro-Asian Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was a 2010-2011 Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, based in the Bureau of European and Euro-Asian Affairs at the United States Department of State. From 2008 to 2010, he was Associate Director of the International Security Studies at Yale University, and he received a PhD in Diplomatic History and an MA in Political Science from Yale, with his BA in International Studies and Russian Studies from the University of Oklahoma. And finally, we thank you. Good to have you with us. And Neil Brown currently serves as non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Energy Transition Forum and Lugar Diplomacy Institute, senior advisor at the Goldman Global Strategies, and is the founding director of the board, on the board of the Lugar Center. He previously served as senior professional staff member for the Energy Security at the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as a senior advisor to Republican Senator Richard Lugar, who we all remember very well and are grateful for his service and grateful for your service to him. He's also, I might add, a Rhodes Scholar. So we have a very distinguished panel. I would ask each of you to limit your spoken remarks to 5 minutes, put the rest in the record, and then we will have a dialogue and about the issues that you have risen and brought to us today. We will start with Mr. Chow, and you may go straight ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It is my distinct honor and privilege to testify before you today. I understand that you wish me to address the issues related to resource competition in Central Asia, including on pipeline transportation to markets outside the region. I will stay within my competence on issues related to international oil and gas, although I understand the committee is interested in other natural resource competition, which will be addressed by other witnesses. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Central Asia offered a unique opportunity for Western oil companies to enter a known oil and gas producing province, which was previously closed to them. The Soviets had made a number of world-class discoveries, which they did not have the technical capability to exploit, most notably onshore Kazakhstan and offshore Azerbaijan. At the same time, these newly independent countries needed investments to enhance their economic autonomy and thereby protect their future political sovereignty. Oil and gas resources represented obvious immediate opportunities for Western investments. The United States was also interested in helping these countries preserve their political independence by increasing their economic options away from over-reliance on Russia. Additionally, as the largest oil importer in the world, we had an interest in seeing incremental oil and gas supplies outside of the Middle East and OPEC flow into global markets, whether we ourselves import those volumes or not. With the help of Western investments, Central Asia and the Caucasus today produces around 3.5% of global oil supply and holds around 2.5% of the world's known proven reserves of oil. For comparison, this is equivalent to 4 times that of Norway and the United Kingdom combined. Another way of looking at this is to say the region produces around 8.5% of non-OPEC oil and holds around 9.5% of non-OPEC oil reserves. In other words, oil production in Central Asia has added significantly to global supply and will continue to do so in the future. In many ways, the energy future of the region lies as much or more in natural gas than in oil. Central Asia is estimated to hold about 11% of the world's proven gas reserves, mostly concentrated in Turkmenistan, which has lagged behind Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan in attracting outside investments. The region currently produces less than 5% of global gas supply, so there's tremendous potential for growth. In addition to production from Soviet-era discoveries, new discoveries of major oil and gas fields have been made in the region. Deserving special mention are Kazakhstan's Kashagan field, offshore Caspian Sea, which is the largest oil discovery in the world for over 30 years. Turkmenistan's Galkanish gas field, which is the largest onshore gas field in the world, and Azerbaijan's Shakhdeniz gas and condensate field. Given its landlocked geography, Central Asia has to rely on long-haul pipelines to take its oil and gas to market. Previously, Soviet pipelines in the region almost all head to European Russia, either to feed the domestic Soviet market or for transshipment to European markets. Control of these pipelines continue to give Russia leverage over transit of oil and gas from the region to market even after the end of the Soviet Union. However, Western investments in oil and gas production also led directly to investments in new pipelines, which are not controlled by Russia's Transneft or for oil and Gazprom for gas. These include a number of projects that I've put into the record, which I will, in the interest of time, not discuss right now. These new pipelines have diminished Russian control of oil and gas exit out of Central Asia and the Caucasus and helped achieve the objectives from the 1990s of giving the region more economic options and allowing its oil and gas production to flow freely to world markets. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, China was just about to convert from a net oil importer to a net oil exporter to a net oil importer. It was slow off the mark in the race for Central Asian oil and gas. By the time it focused on the region, most of the large production opportunities have already been acquired by Western companies. From a Chinese point of view, they have been playing catch-up ever since. Today, China is the second largest oil importer in the world and an increasingly important importer of gas. With stagnant Chinese production and rapidly growing energy demand, China is destined to replace us as the world's largest oil importer in a decade or so. Its companies have been investing in oil and gas around the world, including in neighboring Central Asia. Chinese companies now produce around 30% of Kazakhstan's oil, although from smaller fields than those operated by Western companies, and hold the only onshore concession in Turkmenistan. In part because of disappointments in dealing with Russia on oil and gas, China has focused on pipeline development from Central Asia, including an oil pipeline from Western Kazakhstan and gas pipeline from Turkmenistan through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to China. China has replaced Russia as the largest importer of Turkmen gas, and this volume is slated to double or triple in the coming years. The next growing source of competition for Central Asian oil and gas is likely to come from India, which closely follows China in growth in oil and gas demand and consequently oil and gas imports. Indeed, as Chinese demographic growth slows and population ages, India's energy demand is commonly forecast to grow faster than China's in a decade or so. With all due respect to the committee, the concept of resource war is often exaggerated. These investments are referred to in Central Asia oil and gas production and pipeline development require tens of billions of dollars and many years to mature. Conflict generally freezes such investments, and resources are then stranded for many years. It is true that there is resource competition in Central Asia, as is true around the world. Our policy concern should be for such competition to be conducted on a rule-based manner, without political coercion, as the chairman referenced, or non-transparent business practices to the disadvantage of the citizens of the host countries and global consumers. As long as the rules of the competition are fair, our oil and oil field services and equipment companies can compete in Central Asia where they are doing rather well. And market competition will drive economic efficiency to the benefit of all. Observing the nature of resource competition and assessing its political consequences will remain an important task for your committee. In Central Asia itself, my humble opinion is control over water resources is more likely to lead to direct conflict than oil and gas. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your testimony, and I might add that we have had already one hearing on water in Central Asia, and we do plan several more hearings focused on water there and elsewhere in the world, but especially focused on Euro-Asian needs, because this is the Euro-Asian Subcommittee. And now, Dr. Bancroft.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Keating, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats. The discovery of new offshore oil and gas deposits in the eastern Mediterranean Sea is one of the most promising global energy developments of the last several years. Handled wisely, these deposits off of Israel and Cyprus, as well as potentially Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria, can contribute to the development and security for countries in the eastern Mediterranean and across a wider swath of Europe. Handled poorly, these resources could become the source of new conflicts in what is already a volatile region. According to the United States Geological Survey, the Levant Basin in the eastern Mediterranean holds around 122 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, along with 1.7 billion barrels of crude oil. While these currently recognized volumes are comparatively small relative to those found in the Persian Gulf, Russia, or the Caspian Sea Basin, they're large enough to have a significant impact on the energy security of states in the eastern Mediterranean and to make some, albeit more limited, contribution to energy security in Europe. The oil and gas resources in the eastern Mediterranean, however, sit at the heart of one of the most geopolitically complex regions of the world. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, tensions between Israel and Lebanon, the frozen conflict on Cyprus, and difficult relations among Turkey, the Republic of Cyprus, and Greece all complicate efforts to develop and sell energy from the eastern Mediterranean. The Syrian civil war has injected a new source of economic and geopolitical uncertainty, and standing in the background is Russia, which is seeking to enter the eastern Mediterranean energy bonanza and to maintain its position as the major supplier of oil and gas for European markets. Amidst all this uncertainty, however, the recently discovered gas fields in the eastern Mediterranean are starting to come into production. A second exploration well was recently drilled off the coast of Cyprus, while Israel's Tamar field started production in June. With mounting uncertainty in Egypt and indeed across much of the Arab world, the ability to meet its energy needs from domestic sources is a critical contribution to Israel's energy security. Yet, Israel's transformation into a significant energy producer is not without its challenges. Most immediate, perhaps, is the question of how Israel will sell its surplus gas on international markets. The most economical option, at least in the short term, would be the construction of an undersea pipeline, allowing Israeli gas to reach European markets through Turkey. Such a pipeline, Israel-Turkey, would be less expensive to build than new liquefied natural gas facilities, would reinforce the recently strained political ties between Turkey and Israel, and would contribute to the diversification of Europe's energy supplies by bringing a new source of non-Russian gas to Europe. Such a pipeline, however, would likely run off the coast of Lebanon and Syria or have to go to Turkey through Cyprus, and both options are fraught with peril. Though Lebanon and Israel have not demarcated their maritime border, Beirut argues that Israel's gas fields cross into Lebanese waters, and Hezbollah has threatened to attack Israeli drilling operations. Syria, of course, is in a state of near anarchy, and in this perilous environment, finding investors willing to build a pipeline will be challenging, and even if built, such a pipeline would be difficult to secure. Going through Cyprus is also difficult, largely because of the difficult relationship between the Republic of Cyprus and Turkey. However, Cyprus's own gas fields represent another potential source of conflict. Turkey has not recognized the Republic of Cyprus's exclusive economic zone and in fact has pressured companies seeking to do business there. It recently also began its own exploratory drilling off of the de facto Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus without permission from the government in Nicosia. The revenues from Cypriot energy could benefit communities on both sides of the island, but only if a political agreement can be worked out in advance. The major alternative to a pipeline from Israel to Turkey would be to build an LNG, a liquefied natural gas facility, to liquefy gas for sale to markets in Asia and the Middle East. Russia, in particular, backs this idea. The push to build new LNG facilities, though, is only one way in which Moscow and its energy companies are seeking to play a larger role in the eastern Mediterranean. In addition to a February 2013 marketing agreement signed with the Israelis at Tamar, Russian companies are also interested in Israel's much larger Leviathan field, as well as in the offshore oil and gas off of Lebanon. Of course, given Russia's interest in preventing competition for its gas in Europe, there are legitimate questions about whether Gazprom would actually follow through on developing any of these concessions that it might win in the eastern Mediterranean. One reason the United States has cared about eastern Mediterranean gas is because of its potential to bolster the energy security of U.S. allies in Europe. Today, this concern is less pressing than in the past. The recent announcement of the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, connected to the Trans-Anatolian Pipeline, heralds the beginning of the long-awaited Southern Gas Corridor, which will bring new supplies from the Caspian to Europe. While small, these projects can be scaled up in the future. The United States itself is also poised to become a significant gas exporter. And finally, the ongoing implementation of the European Union's third energy package is creating a more competitive, liberalized, and deeper market in Europe itself. While all of these developments promote European energy security, as the Congressional Research Service has noted, Russia will remain the principal supplier of Europe's gas for many years. The potential volumes from the eastern Mediterranean could bolster European energy security around the margins, but they're not sufficient to change this fundamental reality. For that reason, Washington's main objective in the eastern Mediterranean should be less about Europe and more about ensuring that this energy does not become a source of new resource conflicts, whether between Israel and its neighbors or over Cyprus. The United States' push for Israeli-Turkish reconciliation, which the promise of energy cooperation has helped facilitate, is a good example of the positive role that the United States can play. U.S. diplomacy in Cyprus should proceed in similar fashion. And likewise, the sharing of energy benefits should also be one element in an ultimate settlement of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. The United States has no reason to oppose the role of Russian companies in the eastern Mediterranean in principle. However, it should work with partner governments in the region to ensure transparency and that the promised production does in fact occur. Eastern Mediterranean energy can advance a range of U.S. interests in the wider region. Absent sustained diplomatic engagement, however, it can also become a source of new conflicts in what is already a very dangerous area. Avoiding that outcome should be the primary focus of U.S. engagement on the future of energy in the eastern Mediterranean. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we have about 10 minutes before a vote is called, and so it is the intention of the chair to finish the testimony. We will then retreat to the floor where we will be casting our ballots on very important issues. And when we come back immediately thereafter for the question and dialogue session of this hearing. General, you may proceed, and we're about to have some votes, so if you could keep it to 5 minutes, that'd be great.
Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Keating, and members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for taking the time to examine emerging foreign threats to the national security and interests of the United States related to the irresponsible and predatory actions of other nations in their pursuit for national resources. I'm a 30-year veteran of the United States Army, and my firm, Guardian 6 Consulting, recently partnered with the Alliance for American Manufacturing, a labor management partnership between some of America's leading manufacturing companies and the United Steelworkers to take a look at vulnerabilities to the American defense industrial base. Our report, Remaking American Security, examined a range of vulnerabilities and, in particular, instances in which reliance on offshore companies deep in the supply chain puts U.S. national security at risk. The defense industrial base really needs to be managed as a part of our force structure. Our report took the approach of linking strategy to forces that we need to win, to the capabilities those forces possess, to the programs that enable those capabilities. Then we drilled deeper. Which supply chains do we need in place and secure so that those programs can be successful? Remaking American Security examines 14 defense industrial base nodes vital to U.S. national security. We investigated lower-tier commodities and raw materials and subcomponents needed to build and operate the final systems. Based on our research, the current level of risk to our defense supply chains and to our advanced technological capacity is very concerning. The bottom line is this: foreign control over defense supply chains restricts U.S. access to critical resources and places American defense capabilities at risk in times of crisis. In the report, we devote a chapter to the importance of access to specialty metals and rare earth elements. Increasingly, these resources are central to modern life and central to modern defense preparedness. And each year, the U.S. Department of Defense acquires nearly 750,000 tons of minerals for an array of defense and military functions. In spite of this clear demand, over time, the United States has become dependent on imports of key materials from countries with unstable political systems, corrupt leadership, or opaque business environments. The United States used to have relatively easy access to many mineral ores, but this situation has changed dramatically as the United States has neglected to preserve its mining base and global demand for minor and unusual chemical elements has surged. Compounding the tensions over access to specialty metals, many countries rich in natural resources take a stance of resource nationalism. Within the past decade, countries have attempted to leverage and manipulate extractive mining by threatening to impose extra taxes, reduce imports or reduce exports, nationalize mining operations, and restrict licensing. Moreover, the countries themselves, notably China, have taken a more aggressive posture towards mineral resources and now compete aggressively with Western mining operators for extraction control. Meanwhile, advanced industrialized countries, including the United States, have abandoned mining and mining exploration, even though global demand for economically and militarily significant ores and chemical elements has risen and will continue to rise. These factors, taken together, present a dangerous and unsustainable situation for our economic and national security. Specialty metals are used in high-strength alloys, semiconductors, consumer electronics, batteries, armor plate, and many more defense-specific and commercial applications. We possess significant reserves of many specialty metals with an estimated value of $6.2 trillion. However, we currently import over $5 billion of minerals annually and are almost completely dependent on foreign sources for 19 key specialty metals. The United States must maintain strategic reserves of those defense-critical elements, strategic elements, that face likely shortages while seeking alternative sources. Congress is beginning to give appropriate attention to this issue and shifting more toward a bottom-up approach to securing the supply chains of key materials, but more must be done. The federal government has not formulated a comprehensive policy approach to address the national security risks of inadequate access to many of these key minerals. In the middle of a complex defense drawdown as well as sequestration, which cuts budgets and deprives our defense planners of flexibility, the defense industrial base can seem like a distant and abstract concern, but it's not. Preserving a robust and innovative defense industrial base is a national imperative, and that starts at the most basic level. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
General, you were right on 5 minutes.
The privilege
Now,
is first, sir.
Now, Mr. Brown, can you do the same?
Being fourth in the batting order, and knowing my problems at baseball, I know that I won't be able to follow the general quite so well as that precision. It's a real pleasure to come to this side of the Capitol and join this distinguished committee. When I joined the Senate committee staff in 2005, we held a lot of hearings on these sorts of issues, and at that time, it was a lot of doom and gloom. For decades, really, we had become conditioned as Americans to be on the receiving end of oil and gas, particularly oil decisions with governments that did not have our best interests at heart. So I'm particularly grateful for this committee, for you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing at a time where Americans are doing what we do best, which is changing the rules of the game through innovation in oil and gas, in unconventional sources, efficiency, alternative energy. We're giving ourselves not only economic opportunities, but much more significant foreign policy flexibility and opportunities around the world, including in Central Asia, which is important both for the issues that Ed mentioned in terms of the volume of oil and gas and other minerals the region has, but also for the strategic benefits and importance given that it sits above Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. There are, I think, two major energy forces happening in Central Asia. One is China, which is using its financial clout to access resources, and the other is Russia. Russia's after power of a different sort, which is political power, by maintaining as much control as possible over transit in particular. It wants to further its own interests in keeping its friends in power. I thought that some context might be useful. Congressman Keating mentioned that local events around the world can really impact the prices Americans pay at the pump, our economy, our national security. And really what's happened in the global oil market in particular is that the rising demand of emerging economies, particularly China, India, and in the Middle East, ironically, has over time really narrowed the margins in the global oil market, which meant, particularly in the mid-2000s, that even small disruptions, attacks in the Niger Delta on Shell's facilities, could have an impact right here at home. Now, the recession, I suppose one good side of the recession is that demand slowed down so that we got a bit more of a window. And also, more recently, the U.S. has boosted supply, giving more flexibility. But that structural shift in markets has not changed. So we can expect more of the same, unfortunately, when the economy picks up. Now, I want to, I think, skip to, seeing my time, skip to what's happening with Russia. And really what you have is, on the Central Asia side, pipelines running north. And that's Russia's lever of control, one of its most important levers of control over those governments. And on the eastern side, the supply routes. So we have major concerns in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Baltics, and dependence on Russia for gas in particular. Now, if Russia were simply to allow markets to work, that dependence would still bring economic detriments, but it would not be I suppose, a strategic concern. But unfortunately, that's not the way Russia operates. We've seen time and again the willingness to use energy as a weapon or for coercion. So the U.S. strategy has really focused on diversification. It was mentioned previously, the Southern Corridor, which recently has had a boost in picking of a pipeline route to deliver Caspian gas on into Europe. But there's still much more work to be done. I'd like to have entered into the record a report that the Foreign Relations Committee on the Senate side put out in December that goes into this in great detail, so that if my testimony, when you read that, doesn't cure your insomnia, then the report will definitely take care of it.
Without objection, the report will be submitted for the record at this point in the record.
Thank you. Three key recommendations from that report and the analysis is, first, for the first time, the United States has the ability to directly aid our allies on gas supplies. We have an abundance of natural gas, and those allies want that gas, whether that's Turkey, which would like to reduce its dependence on Iranian gas, or Central Europe that would like to reduce its dependence on Russian gas. The Congress is currently considering a bill that Congressman Turner put out that would automatically grant export licenses, so I recommend that to you. The second recommendation is that even as we think about our own LNG exports, we also have to focus on pipelines. And to that extent, we need much more high-level engagement on a concerted basis, because decisions in these regions on energy are made at the highest levels of government. So you need to have that kind of constant attention. And the loss of the Nabucco project, which would have delivered gas directly into Central Europe, means that we need to think of new ways to make sure that we have pipeline interconnections to help our allies there. And finally, we need to reemphasize the prospect of a Trans-Caspian pipeline to link infrastructure that originates now in Baku to Turkmenistan. It's been talked about a long time, and it's extremely challenging, but without U.S. leadership, the opportunity will be lost. And I know this committee is also considering a resolution on that issue, so that's well on your radar. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for giving us some food for thought, and we will go and vote. And it is the chair's intention to call this hearing back to order 5 minutes. Mr. Keating, 5 minutes after the last vote. Is that all right with you, Mr. Keating? Okay, so 5 minutes after the last vote, which we are expected to have ready about at around 11:30, I was told. We should be back around 11:30. So this hearing is now not adjourned, but in recess. The hearing will come to order. I want to thank you for holding off. The ranking member, Mr. Keating, will be joining us momentarily. He gave us permission to proceed in the meantime without him. I found all of you, the witnesses, to be offering us some very compelling testimony today. And I think the record of this hearing will be of great value to all of us, and to a great number of people who will be looking through this record. One major truism of our era is we are now living in a time that is different than it was 50 years ago, in that we have huge chunks of the world population that seem to be perched and ready to uplift their standard of living in India, especially in India and China. And we're talking about together, they represent maybe half of the world's population, I believe. And half of the world's population, which in the past seemed to be relegated to living the rest of eternity in poverty and deprivation. This will obviously, if indeed their well-being and their economic well-being is to be uplifted, that will it not, create a huge drain on natural resources. It takes energy to have prosperity for normal people. It takes clean water as well, I might add. And it takes industrialization, or at least the production of wealth using technology to uplift large populations. So thus we face a world now that is going to have, if indeed India and China are to increase their standard of living, this will create a major, it'll exacerbate everything we've been talking about today. And for example, Mr. Chow, you mentioned in your testimony the growing competition in Central Asia for Central Asian oil, and that India is part of this, for this oil and gas competition for that. There are different ideas, as we've heard testimony today, about pipelines that could then maybe connect India and China to this oil and gas in Central Asia. But any pipeline that would go through, or get to India from Central Asia, it seems that it would have to come through, and what's being looked at now as an Turkmenistan, Afghan, Pakistan, India pipeline, TAPI, I think they call it. And is that realistic, Mr. Chow, that they could have that? Is that pipeline really a pipe dream, considering the fact that of what's going on in Afghanistan and the turmoil that pipeline would have to go through?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. I think in my written testimony, I made clear to you that I'm helping our Department of State on figuring out how to advance this pipeline project. And challenges for that project is indeed daunting for quite obvious reasons that we don't need to go into detail here. I think the fundamental reason why this might work, and I say might, is that you have a country in Turkmenistan that has the fourth largest gas resources in the world, that seeks diversification of its export routes so that it doesn't become over-reliant on China as it once was over-reliant on Russia for its natural gas exports. And at the same time, as you've already mentioned, we've got this booming energy market in India. If it's possible to connect the two, and geography dictates that therefore you have to go through Afghanistan and Pakistan, then there are fundamental ingredients that would make that project work economically if you can manage the political and security risks involved. So I think the economics are there, the interests of the government to seek alternative export routes. Is there, by the way, no, it converges rather well with U.S. national interests. In the sense that our interest in the stability of the region, in integrating Afghanistan into both South and Central Asian economies, and also to promote better relationship for Pakistan with its neighbors, most prominently India and Pakistan. So it's a very challenging project. I've worked in this industry for quite a long time. The fundamental economics are there. Whether politically and in terms of security it's achievable or not, we will have to find out.
So let's note that you're saying it's a challenging project, but it's not challenging engineering-wise, is it? It's the challenge has to do with political decisions and political stability and within Afghanistan and that region. India would certainly have a important, let's say, be an important customer for that oil, but at the same time, wouldn't that be a something that Chinese would not want to have developed?
I think that's fair to assume.
So we'd have. So what we have is, Dr. Chow, is the great powers of that region, India and China, have conflicting interests over what to do with that natural resource. And again, that's what this hearing is all about. And we should take note of that and learn from it and maybe try to project what that means in the future. Do any of the other panelists have a comment?
I would just add, Mr. Chairman, if you permit me, that we should not underestimate the interests of the national leaders of the countries involved in Central Asia to balance their interests so that they're not overly dependent on any one of the regional powers. So they have a fundamental interest in diversity of export routes.
Yes, Mr. Brown.
Just maybe to add just a couple of thoughts to that, because you've hit on, I think, something that is both a positive and a negative in this world, which is, even just on a humanitarian basis, we want poor people to rise up out of poverty. Right. And who can blame them for wanting air conditioning and cars and all the sorts of things that we want?
Refrigerators or clean water.
Exactly. And in a ironic sort of way, when we see China, India, other emerging economies go out searching for these resources, it's an indicator of economic activity, which on the other side benefits the United States in terms of a strong trading partner where we can sell our goods and services. So it really is a double-edged sword. In my prepared testimony, I mentioned one manifestation of energy and conflict that we do see happening, and that is around the issue that you've raised, which is electrification and access to power. We see in countries like Pakistan, we just saw it in Egypt, where the inability of governments to provide such a basic resource as power can lead to instability that can then overthrow those governments and directly impact U.S. activities. That's why the work that Ed is doing on TAPI, there's also discussions that the World Bank is working on in electrification to bring from Central Asia. That's essential. There's also a huge, multi-billion person market out there that U.S. companies can access to provide power, whether that's from big stationary plants that might use coal or natural gas or renewables. It's much like the telecommunications and kind of personal goods, soaps and whatnot, industries found in emerging markets where these may be poor people, but they do have purchase power. And so unlike countries that just want to take natural resources, the U.S., we have a position to really invest and also make money in the trading relationships.
So let's hope that there will be some stability enough so that those natural resources, and that's what this is all about, will be able to be utilized to help human beings. If I was in India and I was trying to calculate what I should be doing to strategically, considering that they're what seems to be in an adversarial relationship with China and Pakistan, but China, it seems to me that I would want to help those elements in Turkmenistan and Afghanistan that might be willing to align themselves with India's interests. And again, this is talking about fundamental reasons for conflict. Mr. Mankoff, you mentioned the gas off of the Israeli coast. Would that gas, and we heard mention of Egypt a moment ago, would that gas be something that could be used for bringing peace between Egypt and Israel, and especially now that maybe you have a different potential direction for Egypt rather than the Muslim Brotherhood, an anti-Israeli government? Could perhaps Israel step forward and try to say that that gas could be used for Egypt as well in a peaceful endeavor?
Yes, thank you for your question. The fundamental challenges that face that part of the world are ultimately rooted in politics. And energy, I think, can play a role in addressing the conflicts between Israel and her neighbors, but in and of itself is not sufficient to do that. I think you have to have political agreements, political solutions to some of the problems between those countries, and energy can be a carrot or an inducement for reaching those agreements. There's been discussion in Israel about exporting some of this gas to Jordan, for example, though apparently that has now been caught up in internal
right now,
Israeli
Israel
politics.
is in negotiations on water with Jordan, and especially about this has been going on for a few years now, between the Dead Sea to Red Sea, or the Red Sea to Dead Sea project, which has, there's been step by step, but they have been negotiating at a time when their other factors were driving Israel and Jordan apart. They had this mutual interest in negotiating for water. Perhaps with Egypt and now in the situation that it is, and the government of Egypt is now in a precarious situation, perhaps this would be a good time to try to cement some positive ties based on economic dual interests. General, did you have a comment on those things?
No, sir.
Any comment on the Chinese part with Central Asia and the pipeline?
No, sir, that's not something that we covered in our report.
All right. Thank you very much. I will now turn to my ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you can see that the chairman knows the shortcuts better than I do, coming back from votes. I find this whole issue very important for two reasons, because the effects of it can go either way. These can be areas of conflict to make the situation worse, but they could also be areas, as your testimony indicated, where if things fall the right way, that these countries could have greater control over their own economy, their own energy sources, for instance, and make them more stable and profitable, and being able to do more ancillary businesses from this. So how this breaks is not just unilateral. It can go both ways. And along those lines, General Adams, and coming from Massachusetts, we very proud to have John Adams in front of us testifying. But you mentioned the issue of corruption. And, one of the things in this region that could inhibit business investment are these corruption issues. If you'd like to address what we could do to help in that regard, and then any of the panel members, if you'd like to comment on that, because I see that as one of the real issues that could hinder private investment in that area.
Thank you, Congressman Keating, and the opportunity to answer that question. Allow me to answer the question in the context of what we investigated in our report, specifically the lack of access that the United States has to key minerals and materials that we need for our defense supply chains. And there is, in fact, concerns, and we're concerned, based on our research, that corrupt business practices and manipulation of markets is one of the reasons that we have a lack of access to key raw materials, specifically rare earth elements. As you know, China decided 2 decades ago that they would shore up their extraction industry, their mining industry for rare earths, and they were successful in doing that. And they also were able to basically drive other mining countries out of business of doing rare earth minerals. The last U.S. mine, the Molycorp mine in California, went out of business in 2002. Now, there were other reasons than the fact that the Chinese were driving the prices so that the mine was not economically competitive, but that was certainly a huge factor. And then having attained a near monopoly in the mining of key rare earth elements and minerals, China continued to not only involve themselves in the extraction industry, the extraction of oxides, but pull the entire supply chain for rare earth elements and production of such things as advanced magnets, which is a key. We have advanced magnets in all modern defense electronics. Smart bombs, for example, have to have advanced magnets. China pulled that supply chain into China. Now, is that corrupt? Certainly is manipulation. Is that something that we allowed to happen because we had our eye off the ball? I would argue that that's the case, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. There's another example I'd like to give where the platinum group of metals, platinum is used in a wide variety of applications, but the commercial application we're all familiar with is the catalytic converter. But almost every modern engine has to have platinum group of metals in it, small parts of it, but there has to be platinum group of metals, minerals in almost every modern engine. Most of it is mined in South Africa, and I don't want to go into a long political discussion of the instability in South Africa other than it is what it is. We have to remember the role of the Chinese in that as well. The Chinese have established over the last 20, 30 years excellent ties with countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Is that something that, again, we should note at this point, especially in this august committee? I would argue, yes, we should. So the platinum group of metals comes largely from South Africa. We need that for our defense materials, our defense equipment. And again, is the market being manipulated, or is it corruption? I would argue certainly is manipulation. What we need to do, and I won't belabor the point, but what we need to do is to go to strategy and base our need for our strategic materials in the need for a defense strategy that fits the threats of the next 20, 30 years. We're pretty good at doing strategy. We've got a lot of people over across the river who do that pretty well, and they get a lot of help from this building as well. But we're good at that, and we're good at designing programs that let us execute the strategy. But what we need to do is decide what are those key strategic materials. And if we find that market manipulation is part of the reason we don't have access, then we need to enforce fair trade laws. We need to make sure that we have protection of existing laws and regulations that provide for domestic sourcing for key industries. We have to have a coherent strategy at the U.S. government level to determine what those critical raw materials are, and then we need to act upon that to make sure that we've got secure access to them for our warfighters. Thank you.
I'm reminded, General, with your comments, what some of our top military people in our country said when they said, what is our greatest threat? And many of them have come down to the fact it's our economy. And I think that's part of what you're saying. Mr. Brown, did you want to?
Congressman, I appreciate you bringing up corruption, as it's one piece of a very ugly side of natural resources, particularly in oil and gas, but also in some minerals, where they can be a magnet for some of the worst governance practices in the world. They can embolden authoritarian leaders that may choose to be authoritarian against their own people's interests or against our interests, and we see that around the world. In the extreme, it can even lead to conflict. It undermines political stability, and you see internal conflict around the use of those resources and the revenues. So the best example of that, of course, is the Niger Delta. And as you mentioned, that's a good example of a major company then having its infrastructure, its oil be shut in because of that violence. Now, Central Asia, fortunately, does not face that level of violence, but we all know that the revenues from these resources are supporting some rather poor governance practices. And, of course, you see the same thing in Russia. I think the unfortunate side is that we have limited leverage on governance of resources, precisely because the governments are rich because of them. So we have very little aid money going in. At the same time, we have competing priorities, so we have strategic needs in Central Asia, so we can only do so much. But there is a good news story, which is that Congress a couple years ago took the step to really institutionalize norms that are focused on the fact that information is the necessary first step to improve governance in these countries, to empower civil society, to empower the press, and to empower investors. So laws are now in place that will bring to light the revenues that are paid to these governments so that then that information can be used effectively. In your opening comments, you also mentioned the Voluntary Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Well, probably not that many people know, but the U.S. now has decided to lead by example. And so the government, led by the Department of Interior, companies and civil society are just yesterday, actually, there was their most recent meeting. They're coming up with common practices so that we can show the American people what the federal government is bringing to bear. And that's going to have tremendous impacts in our diplomacy, because one of the things when you go talk to these governments and say, well, you should be more transparent, et cetera, they say, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm happy to say that the U.S. government is now going to be at the lead of that, and I really encourage Congress to become involved in those discussions, because you're the people who are going to have to explain it to Americans when they ask.
Yes, Doctor.
Yes, I would just like to add a word about Central Asia. For the last decade plus, United States engagement in this part of the world has been driven very heavily by the conflict next door in Afghanistan. And that has created a kind of dependence, if you will, on these relatively untransparent, corrupt, and often brutal governments in Central Asia. But because of the dependence that we've had on them for security cooperation, it's been difficult for the United States to place issues of transparency and governance at the top of the bilateral and regional agenda in dealing with these countries. As we begin the transition to the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan over the next year and a half, one of the benefits of this change is that we will be in a position where we're less dependent upon these countries for achieving our core security objectives. And that means that the United States will have increased leverage to push on some of these issues that you raised in your comments. Now, certainly, as Mr. Chow said, the governments in Central Asia are very interested in diversifying their engagements so that they do not become overly reliant, either economically or politically, on either the Russians or the Chinese, which means that they all have and have all expressed a very strong interest in continued and deepening engagement with the United States. In a post-Afghan conflict environment, that means that the United States has the opportunity to push harder, to be more insistent, and to make its engagement more conditional on these governments meeting their obligations on issues of governance and transparency, including on their management of natural resources.
Great. I would just have one other last comment, if I could, Mr. Chairman, and that would be many of these resources, these rare minerals, they're there, but there aren't transportation networks, there aren't infrastructure support to get them. It would be too expensive. So one of the things that came to my mind is if we're engaged somehow in assistance, either the private or the governmental side, in these, maybe there can be linkages between some of those infrastructures being built and making sure there's transparency with the mining and development of many of these rare materials. General, and that's my last question.
Sir, if I may respond to that. you may know that we have looked closely at Afghanistan for the possible extraction of raw materials, specifically rare earth elements, in Kandahar, and how difficult that would be. And what I want to mention is that the search for alternate sources is a good thing, and we should continue to do that. And we should do that first here domestically. We've got great alternate sources for rare earths in Alaska and in the northern Great Plains, as well as California. And I said the last mine in California closed in 2002. Of course, it opened again. The Molycorp mine opened again in 2012. So the search for alternate sources for specifically rare earths should continue. That's a very good thing for us to do. But it begs the question here that we ought to consider as we're looking at sequestration and limited budgets. The U.S. Geological Survey is key to that, and it was key to evaluating the potential for rare earth extraction in Afghanistan as well. And they get a lot of help from the Department of Defense, especially when we're talking about security. And I've met with our Department of Defense executive for working with economic aspects of our Afghanistan involvement. It looks like it's going to be prohibitive for us to get rare earths from southern Afghanistan for security reasons. But the search is the important thing, and I'd like to just put a plug in for the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey. Absolutely essential. It's like the canary in the mine. They are so essential to our being able to detect and identify and to program how we identify these key raw materials for our use. If we're going to use strategy to determine which ones we need to protect, USGS is key to that.
Thank you, General. I yield back.
And now we have Mr. Duncan.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for this hearing. Most of my questions were answered during the dialogue, so I don't have a lot of questions, but I am on the Energy and Minerals Subcommittee of the Natural Resources Committee here in the House, and so the rare earth issue has been something that we've been following for at least the last 3 years that I've been here. And I do concur with the General that we've missed some opportunities with over the last 30 years, but if the administration and Congress will look forward to developing those relationships with the countries that China currently has the relationships with that have the rare earths. But I will also say that, and you just touched on it, we've got a lot of rare earths in this country that are currently, the mining areas and the resources are currently off the table for mining activity and production, just due to a lot of policies current and in the past. And so I believe we need to open up more of those resources here in America. It's not only an energy independence policy, but a security policy with regard to rare earths. And I also want to mention that, Mr. Chairman, I am co-chair of the Transatlantic Working Group with members of European Parliament. And we had members of European Parliament in Washington last week. And one of the topics of conversation was their reliance, European countries' reliance on the natural gas coming from Russia and how concerned they are about stability of that going forward. And we talked about opportunities that the United States oil and natural gas companies have to export LNG to Europe to supply the needs of natural gas to our European traditional allies. And how Europe is definitely looking to the U.S. as a source for that. So there's opportunity if we can expedite LNG terminal applications in this country. We have an abundance of natural gas, and that's everyone's aware of that. We've got opportunity to export that to countries that are more friendly. And it's not only the European Union countries that I talk to, but my understanding is that now, some of the V4 countries, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Slovakia, are very interested in those LNG exports as well, which kind of raises my awareness that it is a real issue because they're sitting so close to those pipelines that come through those countries from the resources to the east. And so I think there's opportunity for American companies in the energy sector, but also think America can take advantage of the resources we've got here. but also echo the General's comments. And let me pause to thank you for your service to our nation, sir. I certainly appreciate it. To echo your comments, we've got to go forward and think about the relationships we have with the countries, South Africa, sub-Sahara countries, but also all across the globe that have the rare earths that we are so reliant on in the automotive sector and the technology sector. You were mentioned cell phones that operate with numerous rare earth minerals that make them work. Without those rare earth minerals, they don't work. They don't hold that data or they don't transmit that data. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to ask any questions, but I want to thank you because these gentlemen have done a fabulous job answering my questions. You guys have done a good job asking questions that were along the lines. So I thank you so much for this important topic, and with that, I'll yield back.
All right. Well, thank you very much. There's just note, General, was in my notes are correct that you testified that there were 700. Mr. Duncan, did you hear this one? Mr. Duncan, oh, he's off. You're going to say that, underscoring Mr. Duncan's point, that your testimony was that we import 750,000 tons of vital minerals and material every year. Is that annually? Is it 750,000 tons or 750 tons?
750,000 tons.
Whew. Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank the witnesses as well. I think that this should be viewed, and this subject should be viewed in terms of national security, but also in terms of in humanitarian terms as well. Because, as I emphasized earlier on, unless we succeed in this arena, ordinary people who now live in total deprivation around the world have no chance at all of improving their standard of living. And while we may, for example, it might be a good thing, and it is a good thing, that if we could bring some competition to the Russian pipeline that now supplies the natural gas to Europe, it would be a good thing that Azerbaijan and others have a competition with that. Competition is good for people's standard of living, and as we have found out in the United States. And so those of us who support the idea of pipelines and helping develop transportation systems for these things, it's not anti-Russian to do that, but it's pro-human being to try to develop more availability of resources, of natural gas to people everywhere, and especially those that are currently under the domination of one source for a vital material like natural gas and such. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why President Reagan opposed that natural gas pipeline from Russia during his administration, because he did not want to provide a country that didn't have free elections, which was the Soviet Union, to have such a dominant role over Western Europe. And whether or not it's a country that has free elections or not, it's a good idea to have several sources for gas and several sources for the vital minerals and materials that we have been talking about today. So with that said, I want to thank all of you for your testimony. This has been one of the many hearings we will have on the need for us to focus on water resources and other resources that are necessary to preserve the peace and to make sure that people have a right to improve their standards of living throughout the world. So with that said, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.